Autism is still diagnosed like it's 1999. And yes, you heard that right. For the past 30 years, physicians and diagnosticians have been using the exact same process to diagnose autism. They look at strictly behaviors. Most children at school age undergo an autism assessment right upon intake into kindergarten, and sometimes even earlier than that, at 18 months old to 2 years old. And practitioners primarily look for the same things. They're going to look for the inability to speak, stemming behaviors, maybe toe walking, or regression in eye contact or in socialization, but very rarely do they look at anything outside of behavior. A grand total of 0 changes have been made to the diagnostic process. Okay, well, maybe not 0 changes because they did fold in Asperger's a couple of years ago, as well as added levels 1, 2, and 3 autism back in 2013. But other than that, no real changes have been made. And this is particularly interesting because while the rates of autism are increasing, they really haven't changed how they screen for it. And many of these individuals live with an extensive list of comorbidities. And comorbidities are conditions that are co-occurring alongside autism. We're going to look at all of these today and discuss whether or not these comorbidities are truly just a coincidence or if they perhaps have a deeper role to play in the ASD diagnosis. Welcome back to the Alethea Project. Okay, so we have a lot to cover today, but first I want to get one thing crystal clear, and that is what exactly is a comorbidity. So that word is coined for one diagnosis that occurs alongside the other. And I believe the direct quote that you can find from good old Wikipedia is going to read a simultaneous presence of 2 or more diseases or medical conditions that occur in a patient. So essentially what this is going to mean is that a comorbidity is going to be something like sleep apnea and obesity have a relationship to one another, but one does not necessarily cause the other. So you can have somebody who's experiencing obesity, but they do not have sleep apnea, or somebody who does have sleep apnea, but they are not obese. So that would be considered something that is co-occurring. Typically, they exist alongside each other, but that's not the rule across the board. The comorbidities that exist with autistic individuals are extensive. They affect everything from neurological development to physical development to conditions like OCD and anxiety, and if I tried to break them all down, we would be here for weeks. So we're going to focus on just the most important and prevalent ones today. And everything that I am presenting to you all can be third-party validated. All this information is coming from websites like the CDC, the Autism Research Institute, Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, their major medical institutions. And anyone who's a validated, accredited, a source of medical research is where I am pulling these statistics and this data for today's episode. So we're going to jump right in and talk about GI issues and eating disorders. So first of all, the stat that's really important for you all to know is that 70 to 90% of individuals diagnosed with ASD are also diagnosed with some type of eating disorder. And the most prevalent ones that you are going to see is ARFID, pica, and a condition called rumination syndrome. Pica makes up about 30% of the diagnosed eating disorders within the ASD population, and this is an intense desire to eat things that are non-food items. So think chalk, dirt, paper, leaves from plants, anything and everything that you can imagine. Dish soap that's not food, that could have a texture to it. It can be a temptation for these kiddos to eat it. And obviously, this is going to cause a lot of significant health issues, right? If you're intaking things that are not intended to be food. And so this requires high levels of supervision, often as well as supplementation, constant detox, activated charcoal, that kind of stuff. Then the next percentage is going to be ARFID, which stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And that's going to make up about 20% of the eating disorders within the autism population. And ARFID is a little bit tricky to diagnose, and clinicians are getting better at recognizing it. But oftentimes, it just at first shows up as picky eating, right? lots of little kids go through phases where all they want to eat is, mac and cheese or chicken nuggets or something random like that. With ARFID, they never really outgrow it. So it gets to the point where these children and adults will often choose to starve themselves over eating a food that is deemed unsafe for them. And an unsafe food can be because of a texture, it can be because of a smell, it could even be from something as simple as a color. I know I worked with a kiddo one time who would only eat the Little Bites chocolate chip muffins, and that's all he ate for the 6 months that I knew and worked with him. And so obviously they had to do a lot of supplementation, and he lost a lot of weight, and there was a lot of concern over whether or not he might have to go on a feeding tube because his eating disorder was so intense he could not tolerate anything else. And then the last one is going to be rumination syndrome, and that one is relatively new even for me. I believe it was added to the DSM-5 around the same time as ARFID and PICA back in 2013, and this one only makes up around 10% of diagnosed eating disorders. And rumination syndrome is where these children and adults will eat food and then regurgitate it back up. This can be voluntary or involuntary, but oftentimes it's a voluntary condition because it's a sensory seeking thing, right? So that for some reason or other, their brains recognize that as positive sensory input. And again, that's going to cause a lot of significant physical issues, similar to what you would see in a bulimic patient when you just have high levels of acidity in your mouth and in your throat. It's going to cause a decay and a lot of problems. Obviously, these eating disorders on their own can cause significant issues. But what I found kind of interesting is that in 2013, that's when we first see the addition of ARFID and PICA, and I believe rumination syndrome, added to the DSM-5. And between 2012 and 2013, we also saw a huge spike in children diagnosed with ASD. And I don't know if there's any correlation between that. I just found it interesting that those particular eating disorders were introduced around the same time that autism spiked. And I know that's something that a lot of clinicians and parents have kind of noticed that pattern and thought, maybe these eating disorders are something more than a comorbidity. Maybe this is actually showing that there is something amuck with the biology of the digestive system with kiddos and adults with autism. So just something interesting to think about. And I pulled a quote also directly from Harvard, just so you can hear it for yourself. And they write that a Harvard study was done in 2012, and we have successfully established a link to autism and GI diseases. Now, of course, you're not going to hear about the study on social media, but it was done, and they stated that we have found solid and reproducible evidence that the parents have been right all along. Based on the data that we're looking at, it is suspected we will soon be able to define several distinct subtypes of ASD that is directly associated with bowel disease. And so this is a super interesting just concept on its own related to eating disorders, but we can't forget that 70 to 90% of the ASD population has a diagnosed eating disorder. An additional 50 to 90% have a diagnosed GI disease, such as like IBS or constipation, acid reflux, that kind of thing. So it's fairly clear to me that the GI thing probably has a strong correlation with autism, maybe more significantly so than just a comorbidity. In addition to these eating disorders and GI issues, it is also very common for a child or an adult with ASD to receive a psychiatric diagnosis. And some of this could be due to the fact that brains do develop differently in people with ASD, so that could contribute to it, but it also could have to do with the sensory sensitivities that they experience. So we'll just blow through the stats really fast so you can have it. So we're looking at 20 to 30% with seizures, 50 to 80% with a diagnosed sleep disorder like insomnia, delayed sleep onset, frequent waking, that kind of thing. 17 to 37% have diagnosed OCD, 50 to 70 has ADHD, 40 meet the criteria for ODD. That's also a relatively new one, oppositional defiant disorder. You can look it up if you like. 30 to 40% have SIB, and 16% classify as extreme, and that's going to be self-injurious behaviors. It's actually estimated that individuals with autism between 10 and 26 have a 4 times greater likelihood of being hospitalized for self-harm. So that is a pretty significant issue that they deal with. 7 to 10% are diagnosed bipolar, 40 to 50 have anxiety disorders, and 20 to 30% have depressive disorders. And conservative estimates from Johns Hopkins and the Autism Research Institute say that around 70% of people with ASD are diagnosed with encephalitis, and this is a type of brain inflammation. These institutions have linked gut issues and they have linked brain inflammation as being extremely common in individuals with ASD. Whether or not we can pinpoint the reason behind brain inflammation is a conversation for another day, but it is a pattern, again, that parents have recognized for a really long time, especially in kiddos who receive a diagnosis a little bit later in life. Oftentimes, parents can pinpoint a particular event that caused their child to regress and ultimately receive that ASD diagnosis. So, is your head spinning yet? Because mine kind of is, but we're not done. ASD also is going to show up on EEGs. So that means that the physical makeup of the brains of autistic people looks different than the brains of neurotypical people. And this can come in one of two ways. The frontal lobe development can be affected, as well as the development of the brainstem, or you can see differences in the way that neurons are firing and communicating with each other. And that is what's going to contribute very heavily to the sensory seeking behaviors, being hyposensitive to textures or hypersensitive to textures. It also is going to cause that disconnect between the mind and the body that a lot of individuals with autism experience. They're just not in tuned to where they are in space. And this can all be seen through EEGs and brain scans. All of this to say that the CDC has determined that up to 95% psychiatric comorbidity. And for the medical field, this is actually hugely significant because typically the verbiage is going to change surrounding a medical diagnosis if a comorbidity occurs in over 50% of cases. So if 50% of people who were obese also were diagnosed with sleep apnea 100% of the time, typically that language would change. It would be a symptom, right? When it comes to autism, we're seeing these comorbidities occur in 95% of cases. So the question becomes, why haven't they changed the verbiage? Are all these comorbidities truly unrelated to the ASD diagnosis, or is there something deeper at play that we haven't considered yet? Are we actually looking at the biology of autism? ASD is really the only condition where symptoms get reframed as behaviors. We classify regression as neurodiversity and inflammation, as meltdowns and pain, as stimming, and even major advocacy groups, like we talked about, the ASAN and Autism Speaks, fight so hard against the medicalization of autism. But why? It's hard to understand how they can expend so much energy defending the idea of neurodiversity and painting ASD as a superpower when the stats don't lie. 95% of the time, there's something deeper going on. There's a medical condition happening that we're not talking about or addressing. To insist that society must view ASD as only a type of neurodiversity is not acceptance. That is neglect. And really, this is the point that I want to drive home because the stats and the stories, they don't lie. It's not an exaggeration to say that children and adults with ASD are being medically neglected. Parents are dismissed for asking questions and judged for wanting additional testing and support from their physicians. So now we have all this information and we know that comorbidities happen more often than not. But what can we really do about it? Well, to doctors, nurses, or any medical practitioners that may be listening, I highly encourage you to listen to parents. Autism moms and autism dads are many, many things, but very rarely are they dramatic. So if they come to your clinic asking for additional testing, listen to what they're asking for. Run the additional test, listen to their concerns, because chances are the changes that they're seeing in their child aren't just because of ASD and the behaviors that come alongside of it. I've known so many families who got medically gaslighted for years and told that their children's behaviors and their children's habits were just because of the autism diagnosis, when years down the line it turned out to be something like diabetes or celiac disease. but they had to fight so hard to get that diagnosis. By the end of the process, they were exhausted and defeated. For us common folks, there are 2 key steps that I believe we can take. And the first is going to be the same as for doctors in the medical field, and that is listen to parents. Honestly, a lot of the times they know what they're talking about. And if a parent comes to you with questions, or maybe they want resources, or maybe you have a connection to a doctor or a nutritionist, give them that connection. Listen to their concerns. Hear what they're trying to say. Whether or not you can actually do anything about it, sometimes a listening ear is super helpful. And the second practical tip is going to be, don't try to be a troll or an expert online. I see so many comment section battles when moms are posting asking for help for their child who maybe is dealing with GI issues or neurological issues, and they go to social media and they say, hey, I'm looking for something non-traditional. Maybe I want to try supplementation. Or I need something really traditional. I need to figure out how to get my child an EEG or a CAT scan. And war in the comment sections, because how dare this mother treat her child's ASD diagnosis like a medical condition? It's really not necessary. Regardless of where you are on the spectrum, regardless of how involved you are in it, avoid being a troll if at all possible. And honestly, that's going to go a long way, because it really is more helpful at the end of the day to be a support system rather than beating these families to a pulp. And lastly, one more bonus point is, if you feel so led, maybe do a little bit of research into what your community offers that's alternative and holistic support for families looking to treat their children's comorbidities. I know where I'm located, we have a ton of really phenomenal practitioners, chiropractors, nutritionists, therapists, places like eQuest and MainGate that really specialize in a whole body approach when it comes to treating autism. And building that community around these families and around these individuals is going to be huge, right? Because if they can figure out and get to the bottom of their children's discomfort, honestly, that child is going to be able to better thrive, even in spite of what might be a challenging ASD diagnosis. Whether or not you actually choose to go forth and build a network of providers in your local area is kind of beside the point. You are now fully educated on autism and the comorbidities that often accompany it. So I would encourage you to go from here with an open mind. We don't really know if all these different diagnoses that accompany ASD truly are comorbidities, or if we're looking at the actual biology of autism. That still, it remains to be determined. But having a support network and a society that looks at all this with an open mind, rather than with a defensive, closed-off attitude, is going to do a world of good for these families and for these children. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Alethea Project. If you liked, loved, or hated what you heard, please feel free to comment down below, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you next time.